This training video is sponsored by the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services in partnership with the Tennessee Association of Mental Health Organizations, TAMHO. Funding was provided in part under Grant Number 6H79SM086148, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. The views, policies, and opinions expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of SAMHSA or HHS. This learning series is entitled How to Administer the Mini SIPS. An overview of psychosis and psychosis-risk syndromes will be provided, including a focused training of the mini-structured interview for Prodromal-Risk Syndromes, mini SIPS, a brief assessment of psychosis risk. A portion of time will be dedicated to the application and practice of the mini SIPS in interactive sessions. There will also be a discussion of self-report assessment instruments and assessment best practices. Learning objectives include 1. Describe attenuated divided by subthreshold symptoms typically assessed to determine psychosis. Risk status. 2. Identify benefits of specialized treatment for this population. And 3. List the components of the mini SIPS. Presenting this topic is Dr. Jason Schiffman. Jason Schiffman, a professor at the University of California, Irvine, earned his PhD in clinical psychology from USC. His research advances the identification and treatment of individuals at risk for psychosis, focusing on refining diagnostics, implementing psychosocial interventions, reducing stigma, and promoting health for all. With over 200 publications, he has secured over $20 million in funding, including several active NIMH grants involving individuals at clinical high risk, CHR, for psychosis. Dr. Schiffman co-founded 3 university community partnerships, including a SAMHSA-funded CHRP program, and is among the few certified trainers of the structured interview for psychosis-risk syndromes. He also consults for CHRP programs nationwide. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Schiffman.
Hi, my name is Jason Schiffman, and I'm a professor and a director of clinical training, Department of Psychology at UC Irvine. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about the mini SIPS today. Early screening for clinical high risk for psychosis in young people and practical applications. I'm really glad you're here today. Today's training is built around something small but mighty, the mini SIPS. Our goal is to demystify this tool, deepen our shared understanding of psychosis risk, and empower you with practical strategies to bring this knowledge into your work. We'll begin with a brief review of psychosis to make sure we're all grounded in what the core symptoms look like, positive, negative, and disorganized symptoms, and how they might manifest in different clinical presentations. From there, we'll move into an overview of psychosis risk, paying special attention to the DSM-5's inclusion of the attenuated psychosis syndrome, or APS. Now, this is the term that the mini SIPS has adopted, but it's also synonymous in this space with clinical high risk for psychosis, or CHRP for short. So you may hear me talk about APS or CHRP, but they're all basically referring to the same set of symptoms and constructs. All of this represents a critical opportunity to intervene before distressing symptoms escalate into full psychosis. Then we'll dive deep into the mini SIPS itself, an abbreviated, structured interview that can be administered in about 15 to 25 minutes. It's designed to identify youth who might be experiencing early signs of psychosis in a way that's efficient, targeted, and clinically useful. Whether you're new to this tool or already familiar, we'll go step by step to ensure clarity and hopefully build confidence. We'll also cover some additional assessments to consider, including self-report measures that complement the mini SIPS, such as the PRIME screen and the PQB. Importantly, we'll also zoom out and reflect on different roles, whether you're a clinician, case manager, educator, peer specialist, or something else entirely. Each of us brings a unique lens and purpose to this work. We'll talk about how we may have different goals, diagnostic, engagement focus, preventative, and how those goals shape what we emphasize during the assessment. We'll touch on competence and understanding, recognizing that the mini SIPS requires foundational clinical judgment, cultural humility, and the ability to discern nuance. And finally, I'll share a bit about my goal, which is nothing short of a revolution. A revolution in how we identify and support and walk alongside young people navigating the confusing, often frightening experiences related to psychosis risk. a revolution in our systems, our training, and our care. Because with the right tools, the right mindset, and the right support, we can change lives in really positive directions. So let's get started. Before we can assess for risk, we need a shared understanding of what we're actually looking for. So let's pause here and briefly ground ourselves in the core symptom domains of psychosis. We'll typically group symptoms into three categories: positive, negative, and disorganized. Positive symptoms refer to experiences that are added to someone's typical mental life, like things like hearing voices that others can't hear or holding strong beliefs that don't align with reality. These are often the most visible and can be the most startling for clients, families, and providers alike. We call them positive not because they're good, but because they represent additions or excesses, something that's extra that's entered into the person's experiences. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, reflect what's missing. They'd be what we'd expect to see, but don't. These might include low motivation, emotional flatness, or social withdrawal. They can be quieter, more easily overlooked, but deeply impairing. And then there are disorganized symptoms, which represent maybe a mix of additions and absences. These might include disorganized speech, confused thinking, or odd behavior that doesn't quite follow a logical pattern. These categories, positive, negative, and disorganized, are central to how we understand psychosis, and many of them show up throughout the mini SIPS. In fact, when we administer the mini SIPS, we're zeroing in on a few very specific positive and disorganized symptoms. Not yet full threshold, but meaningful symptoms. We call these attenuated symptoms. We're asking questions that help us detect early signs like unusual thought content, hallucination-like experiences, or communication difficulties. And we're trying to understand how these symptoms have evolved, how often they happen, how much they get in the way, and how the person makes sense of them. And that's where this work becomes both science and a little bit of art. Because as you'll see throughout the rest of this training, the mini SIPS is more than just a checklist. You can think of it as a lens, a way of tuning into subtle shifts in a young person's experiences before they become entrenched, a way of catching change early, responding compassionately, and helping young people and their families reclaim a sense of agency and hope. All right, let's keep going. First, let's talk about hallucinations, one of the hallmark positive symptoms of psychosis. Hallucinations are sensory experiences that occur in the absence of any external sensory input. That means the person may hear, see, feel, taste, or smell something that isn't actually there. While auditory hallucinations are the most common, such as hearing a voice that others don't hear, hallucinations can occur across any of the 5 domains. What's important to understand, especially in the context of the mini SIPS, is that these experiences on their own aren't always pathological. In fact, they're relatively common in the general population. Think about how many people report hearing their name called when no one else is around, or catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of their eye. These things happen. The question isn't always if someone has these experiences, it's how those experiences are showing up. So, when do hallucinations become a concern? Well, we pay particular attention when these experiences are intense, vivid, or overwhelming, distressing, emotionally upsetting, or frightening, or when there's a notable change in how often or how strongly they're occurring. In the mini SIPS, we don't just ask whether these experiences happen. We ask how often, how much they interfere, how the person interprets them, and how they've evolved over time. The goal isn't to pathologize someone's reality, it's to understand their experience in context. Are they scared by what they're hearing? Are they withdrawing because of it? Are they questioning their own perceptions, or do they feel fully convinced? That level of nuance helps us distinguish between typical perceptual phenomenon, attenuated or subthreshold hallucination-like symptoms, and full threshold psychosis. And it's the nuance that makes the mini SIPS such a powerful tool. With just a few well-phrased questions and a trained empathic ear, we can begin to see the full picture. Now, let's look at another key category of positive symptoms, delusions. Delusions are false beliefs that a person holds with strong conviction, even when there's clear evidence to the contrary. These beliefs often are resistant to logic or reassurance and can feel incredibly real to the person experiencing them. There's several common types we see in clinical practice. Persecutory, like the FBI is tracking me. Referential, where someone believes a TV show or song or something like that is secretly communicating with them. Grandiose, involving an exaggerated sense of one's talent or importance. Control, where thoughts or actions feel manipulated by outside forces. Somatic, such as the belief that something foreign is growing inside the body. Another example is erotomanic. Erotomanic. Sorry about that. But that's like the belief that like a public figure, say like Britney Spears or something like that, is secretly in love with them. Now, just like with hallucinations, not all odd beliefs are pathological. People hold unusual ideas all the time. The key is understanding how these beliefs function in someone's life. So, when do delusions raise red flags? Problems arise when the beliefs are distressing. There's notable change, and especially when there's a high level of conviction with no or little doubt about the level of tenacity. We explore beliefs that might feel unusual, exaggerated, or reality bending, and we ask about their intensity, frequency, impact, as well as their insight. We're listening not just for what someone believes, but how they believe it. Do they have doubt? Can they reflect on how unusual the belief is? Does it interfere with their daily life? Has it worsened recently? That's how we begin to map where someone falls on the spectrum from typical to attenuated to full threshold psychosis. And the mini SIPS helps us listen more deeply. When we listen with curiosity, not judgment, but curiosity, with clinical structure instead of assumptions, we give people space to open up. And that can be a powerful beginning to healing. When most people think of psychosis, they're thinking about schizophrenia, but psychosis itself refers to a broader category of symptoms and manifests in different disorders like bipolar disorder, major depression, substance abuse, and more. Now, psychosis-risk, that represents the phase before full psychosis, where individuals experience warning signs or symptoms without reaching the threshold of a psychotic disorder. I bring this up to remind us that we can see it in a lot of different disorders, and psychosis can be due to a lot of different causes. As we talk about symptoms and risk, I want to pause and center this message. There is hope. There is always hope. A diagnosis, even a risk state, is never the end of the story. People experiencing psychosis or those at risk are so much more than their symptoms and their labels. And many go on to live meaningful, rich, connected, and fulfilling lives. Take John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning mathematician whose journey with schizophrenia was chronicled in the movie A Beautiful Mind. Or Ellen Sachs, a renowned legal scholar, MacArthur Genius recipient, an advocate for mental health, who shares her lived experience in the book, The Center Cannot Hold. These are just two examples, public ones, but they're reminders of something we too often forget. Recovery is real and should be thought of as the expectation and not the exception. Healing doesn't always mean the absence of symptoms. It can mean living with them, growing through them, even finding strength and meaning because of them. And many people, perhaps someone you're working with right now, report positive changes as a result of their journey. Greater empathy, stronger purpose, closer relationships, a deepened sense of identity. One of the biggest predictors of recovery is early intervention. And early intervention is facilitated by early identification, which is what the mini SIPS is all about. When we offer young people a sense of hope, a path forward, and a voice in their own care, we plant the seeds for lifelong resilience. All right, so I want to just sort of keep that at the heart of everything we do and everything we talk about today. Psychosis-risk. The primary motivator behind early intervention is the concept of the duration of untreated psychosis. If you think of this arrow as the passage of time, that point in time there could be thought of as when a person crosses a threshold for psychosis. And the next point is when effective intervention is implemented. The duration of time between these 2 points is called the duration of untreated psychosis. And it lasts close to 2 years on average, a little bit less now. Maybe we're trying to wind that arrow backwards in time a bit. More recent data suggests that we're making progress, and that DUP might be shorter than 2 years on average in the US. Regardless, the longer this period, the worse the outcomes. There's room to continue pushing that needle further back in time, working with folks before they cross a threshold for psychosis, soon after the onset of risk, has the potential to prevent further deterioration and possibly prevent psychosis altogether. When we catch signs early and respond quickly, we see benefits that ripple across nearly every domain of life. People experience better long-term outcomes overall. They often require less intensive services, especially inpatient or crisis care. They tend to show fewer negative symptoms, like withdrawal or lack of motivation. And they experience less social and occupational impairment, meaning more connections, more stability, and more opportunity. Shorter DUP is also associated with fewer neuropsychological deficits, less psychological distress, and from a systems perspective, fewer costs and burdens on mental health services. Now, the mini SIPS, it plays a key role here. It gives us a brief, structured, and accessible way to identify when someone might be in the early stages of psychosis, before symptoms escalate or become entrenched. By trainings like this and getting the word out, folks in the profession can use this tool, the mini SIPS. We can open more doors to early care. And again, the earlier we respond, the more possibilities we create, not just for prevention, but for empowerment, recovery, and importantly, hope. All right, so now that we've talked about early signs and the power of early intervention, a natural question arises. How can we reach young people who are at risk before things escalate? The answer starts with something deceptively simple. It's about knowledge being power. We empower care when we are equipped, and we equip others with the right information. So that includes therapists, teachers, school counselors, pediatricians, youth mentors, peer specialists, really anyone in a position to notice subtle changes and to respond with curiosity and compassion. That's why training is so essential. When we teach providers and others who work with youth what to look for, what's typical, what might be a cause for concern, and how to talk about it, we start shifting the system. And it's not just about awareness, it's about access. That's where tools like the mini SIPs come in. It's short, it's structured, making it accessible, and when used appropriately, it can help us distinguish between general mental health concerns and early psychosis risk, guiding us towards the next right steps, whether that's support, referral, or further assessment. Okay. All right, so far so good. Hopefully so far we're building this rationale and motivation for what we're doing here. Now I want to talk briefly about what the DSM refers to as the attenuated psychosis syndrome. So here you see the DSM's definition of the attenuated psychosis syndrome. I'll read it with you. It says, at least one of the following symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech, is present in attenuated form. Now, the word attenuated means thinned out or lessened. So subthreshold, not full manifestation, but somewhat a little bit less. Then it goes on to say, with relatively intact reality testing, meaning the person can distinguish it from full threshold. They don't have a full level of conviction in the veracity or reality of the experience. And it goes on to say, and is of sufficient severity or frequency to warrant clinical attention. What that suggests is it's not just an experience, but it's reached a threshold where it would warrant clinical care, making it a symptom or something that bothers the person. Now that's a screenshot from the DSM. You'll see it here if you're interested in billing under 298.8 or F28 here. The attenuated psychosis syndrome is under the other specified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders section. All right. Now we're building from a rationale and an overview and slowly working our way into and towards the mini SIPs. As we take our first step along that path, I want to talk about the origins of the mini SIPs. So to fully appreciate the mini SIPs, it helps to understand where it came from. It came from the structured interview for psychosis-risk syndromes, or the SIPS. Not the mini SIPs. It's like its parent. All right, so the SIPS is one of the most, in fact, if not the most widely used tool in the clinical high risk for psychosis literature, or the attenuated psychosis for literature. It provides a structured way to assess for symptoms across 4 domains: positive, negative, disorganized, and general symptoms. And it helps us identify where someone falls on the continuum of low risk, high risk, or already experiencing psychotic level intensity. It's a good tool, but like many great tools, it comes with some significant trade-offs. In particular, the first one I want to mention is that the SIPS requires significant training, about 14 hours, maybe a little bit more, plus experience with diagnostic interviewing that precedes this. And to make matters more challenging, it takes at least an hour, oftentimes 2 hours, to administer, which can be a heavy lift in many real-world settings, especially with limited resources and or when trying to reach youth early, not just for the clinician and the setting that they're working with, but also for the family and the youth as well. This is where the mini SIPS comes in. The mini SIPS is built on the foundation of the full SIPS. It carries the same spirit and intention, but it's briefer, more accessible, and it's also more adaptable. It focuses on a concise set of positive and disorganized symptoms that are especially relevant for early detection, and it can be administered in about 15 to 20 minutes, maybe 25. Now, both tools do serve an important purpose, but for expanding early identification beyond research settings into schools, let's say, in clinics and community programs, the mini SIPS opens a door. So while we honor the rigor and utility of the full SIPS, and I'm a SIPS trainer and a SIPS advocate, today's training is about using that foundation to build something even more nimble, responsive, and importantly, scalable. All right, and now we arrive at the focus of today's training, the mini SIPS. As I mentioned, it is a condensed version of the full SIPS, streamlined yet still grounded in the science. It was developed to be an efficient, scalable, and structured interview that has applicability in real-world settings where time and resources are limited. The version that I'm sharing with you today, again, I mentioned this 15 to 25 minutes or so, but it's also effective, especially when used by people with the right foundation in interviewing, diagnostic thinking, and humility in their approach to assessment. There is an online training for this version that takes about 30 minutes that supplements what we're doing and talking about today. I highly recommend it, but I'll talk more about that towards the end of our time together. But in general, the tool is best used by people who have some experience with clinical assessment and who are clear on why they're administering it, whether for screening, referral, triage, or monitoring. Now, the mini SIPS includes 3 key sections, each designed to tap into subtle early signs of psychosis risk: delusion-like symptoms, hallucination-like symptoms, and disorganized communication. Together, these domains give us a structured lens into early emerging patterns of experience that, if left unchecked, could develop into something more severe. But more importantly, this tool gives us a chance to intervene early, partner compassionately, and shift trajectories in really positive ways. All right, let's dive into each section and explore how the mini SIPS works in action and in reality. Okay, all right, now this tool was designed to be brief, but not basic. It assumes that a person administering it has some foundational knowledge and clinical experience. Specifically, that you know a little about psychosis risk, not just the symptoms, but the broader context, trajectories, variability, and what early signs might look like. Similar to some of the things that we've already begun talking about. All right, now that you've had prior experience conducting diagnostic interviews and you know how to ask structured questions while staying connected, flexible, and person-centered, these are key. That you understand what it means to be a sensitive assessment or assessor, to be mindful of developmental, linguistic, and individual and contextual factors when interpreting responses. This is incumbent upon you to be a good mini SIPS assessor. And I want to make sure that you have a sense as to how to assess things like onset, frequency, distress, and impairment, and then how to weigh those elements in a nuanced and human way. That'll help with your mini SIPS assessments as well. So here's the bottom line. The mini SIPS is not a plug and play tool. It's not for everyone, and that's fine. That's okay. But everyone can learn from the mini SIPS, even if you're not administering it yourself. Engaging with its structure can deepen your understanding of psychosis risk, enhance your ability to have informed conversations, and sharpen your lens for early signs. And if you are someone who's qualified and is going to use it, the mini SIPS, it can be a game changer, a practical, compassionate, and efficient tool to help guide critical clinical decisions at perhaps just the right moment when a person is in need. The first, whoops, hold on a second. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, the first section of the mini SIPS is delusions, which focuses on delusion-like symptoms. Here we're exploring 3 key areas: unusual thought content, suspiciousness, and grandiosity. We'll look not just at what someone believes, but how strongly, how often, and how much it's affecting their life. Okay, let's break each one down in turn. Okay, so delusions. Some examples from the mini SIPS, delusions, symptoms, queries. Do you ever get confused whether something you've experienced is real or imaginary? Do you ever feel like your thoughts are being said out loud or that other people can hear them? Do you ever feel that people around you are thinking about you in a negative way? Have you ever found yourself feeling mistrustful or suspicious of other people? Generally, these questions are getting at things that are imaginary, hard to explain, odd, or potentially confusing. Let me read this example vignette with you. Chris expressed a belief that people might be able to read their mind. They provided several recent examples describing situations where others finished their sentences or said exactly what they were thinking. At times, they reported that people made comments that they had dreamt about. These experiences confused them, and they'll sometimes ask them to clarify if they somehow knew about the dream. Chris stated, "It's creepy. I feel like they may be reading my mind." They also mentioned that if they feel a special connection with someone, they believe it's due to a telepathic communication between them. Despite these feelings, they acknowledge that telepathy isn't possible or potentially not real. These things happen at least a few times per week. Okay, first thing we want to learn more about are the experiences Chris is having that seem to fit within the category of delusion-like. Things like people reading their mind, sentence finishing, dreams, and telepathy. It's important to keep in mind that these are not necessarily symptoms. They're experiences at this point, but we need more context to know if they are in fact symptoms. Now we want to look for a level of intensity, distress, and behavior change. For Chris, they reported that these experiences are confusing, indicating some level of intensity. There's some behavior change in that they ask others for clarification and they say it's creepy, suggesting some level of distress or, at minimum, some level of bothersomeness. Another thing the mini wants us to consider is level of insight. This is how we generally distinguish risk from full psychosis. I'm going to talk more about that as we move forward. But you see here that Chris used the word might and acknowledged that at least some of their experiences aren't possible. These clues give us the sense that Chris holds some level of doubt and is not fully convinced as to the reality of the experiences they had. This would suggest that Chris is more on the side of risk and not full psychosis. All right, so here you can see the primary experience symptom queries for delusions, and they line up as follows. So questions 1 through 9, those are considered unusual thought content. And then questions 10 through 13 cover suspiciousness. 14, 15, and 16 cover grandiosity. All right. Hopefully, seems like it could make sense. I'm trusting that you're sticking with me and that this is moving along in a really positive way. Now, let's shift over to hallucinations, and as the mini-SIPS calls it, hallucination-like symptoms because they're subthreshold. Some examples from the mini-SIPS hallucination questions include things like, do your ears ever play tricks on you? Or do you ever hear sounds like banging, clicking, hissing, ringing in your ears, footsteps, or your name being called? Do you ever hear a voice that others don't seem to hear? Do you ever see things like flashes, flames, vague figures, shadows, or movements out of the corner of your eye? And do you ever see things that others can't or don't seem to see? Let me read this second vignette with you. This is about Jordan. And Jordan reported hearing someone say their name, as well as a beeping noise, similar to the sound of a smoke detector with low batteries. They also mentioned seeing movement out of the corner of their eye, but nothing was there when they looked directly. Jordan described seeing squirrels in the room, despite knowing that this is not possible. Additionally, they recounted seeing a figure that resembled a lady, which then faded away. They report that these things happened at least once per week, sometimes more. They're not distressing, and they don't change their behavior based on them, but they do get in the way sometimes. Although they reported that these things were perplexing, they acknowledged that they must all be in their head at some level. Okay, so what are we thinking about with Jordan? Now, let's focus in on the experiences. If we were working with Jordan, we might ask a gentle probing question as simple as, tell me more about that, to some of these highlighted components here. Like, what are the experiences here? Hearing someone say their name as well as a beeping noise, movement out of the corner of their eye, the squirrels for sure, the lady. All this would warrant additional follow-up with a kind and non-judgmental sense of curiosity. Also, we want to look for intensity, distress, and behavior change. For Jordan, this might require some probes like how much does it sound like a smoke detector? How loud? How vivid? Seems like the movement out of the corner of their eye was pretty unformed, as when they looked, it was gone. But the squirrels, that seemed formed and therefore potentially pretty intense. I definitely want to hear more about the vividness of the lady as well and how she fades out. Now, Jordan says these things are distressing, um, and they do get in the way sometimes, and they are perplexing, which is at least a modest indication of some level of distress. All right, so what about level of insight? Jordan does show some insight. They say things like, I know this is impossible and it must all be in my head. That language tells us they're questioning the reality of their experiences, even if they don't fully understand them. They're not fully convinced that these perceptions are real. They're confused, yeah, but they're not locked into a fixed belief and they aren't drastically changing their behavior in response. That level of insight makes me feel like it would be inconsistent with full threshold psychosis. So, from a mini SIPS perspective, we can ask more questions, but from what we have here, we'd likely consider this within the attenuated range, particularly if other criteria like frequency and distress are also met. Okay, this is just a snapshot, or excuse me, a screenshot of some of the questions, so you can get a sense as to what it really looks like on paper. What you see here, the first two questions are about auditory hallucinations. Questions 3 and 4 are visual, and then question 5 covers tactile, gustatory, and olfactory. So feeling, tasting, and smelling. All right, the third and final section of questions is around disorganized communication on the mini SIPS. So let's turn to this one. Disorganized communication. This one is a little different from the other sections, in large part because you're relying mostly on what the participant tells you for the other ones, but in this one, you also have to focus on how what you observe as the interviewer. So we're listening for things like odd or unusual speech, difficulty getting their point across, or moments where we're having trouble following them, despite trying, to bring them back around and to keep them on topic. This could show up as rambling, jumping from topic to topic, or using words in ways that don't quite fit. Sometimes the participant or the client may not even notice it's happening. So it's up to us to track it carefully and consider frequency, interference, and change. That said, we don't rely on observation alone. The mini SIPS also encourages us to ask about the subjective experience of disorganized thinking. We might ask questions like, do you have trouble getting your point across? Or do you find yourself going off track or losing your train of thought? Have others commented that they have trouble understanding you? And you can see those questions here. These roughly kind of correspond to odd speech, the first one, unfocused speech, and then a bit of meandering is captured in that third question. Do you ever completely lose your train of thought? One of the most important distinctions we make when using the mini SIPs is the difference between risk for psychosis and psychosis itself. So I want to spend some time talking about that, and then we're going to keep diving deeper into the mini SIPs. All right, so a core principle of the mini SIPs is this. Once someone has experienced full psychosis, they can no longer be considered at risk. So if a person has ever had psychosis, they can't again be at risk. Now, determining where someone falls, risk versus psychosis, it isn't always straightforward. That's why the mini SIPs helps us to focus on a few key factors. Let me advance those. All right, so first, the intensity and severity of symptoms, the first of the key factors. Are the experiences vague and intermittent, or are they very vivid, overwhelming, and deeply disruptive? The latter would be on the psychosis side of the continuum. Let's see, a second key factor in determining is level of conviction. Does the person hold these beliefs or perceptions with absolute certainty, or is there doubt or insight? All right, let's look at the quotes I have on this slide. I'm pretty sure my mom is considering poisoning me slowly, but that doesn't make any sense, right? Here we see some suspiciousness, but it's paired with self-questioning and insight. This could fall within the attenuated range. Let's see another example here. I think I see a lizard or something crawl by while I was in class, but no one else does. I don't see anything when I double check, so I don't know. Again, this shows perceptual disruption, but it's fleeting, questioned, and not fully believed. There's uncertainty. That kind of doubt is what separates risk from psychosis. So as you move through the mini SIPs, always ask yourself questions like, how strong is the person's conviction? How much distress or interference is this causing? And is there still room for reflection or reality testing? Here's a bit more on this important topic. For hallucinations, risk might be something subtle, like seeing shadows or flickers of light, whereas psychosis, full threshold, is more formed and fixed, like seeing a person hovering outside a window. The same goes for delusions. Feeling like people are staring might be an attenuated belief, especially if there's doubt. But being fully convinced your neighbor is trying to kill you and changing your behavior because of it, that's much more in line with threshold psychosis. Okay, coming together? I hope so. As we march forward, I think I want to talk now about showing you what the tool actually looks like. First, I'll start with what the tool looks like at first glance, the structure, the layout, and the flow. Then we'll walk through a more detailed description of how to administer it, what to listen for, and how to rate responses accurately, point by point. All right, here's page 1. It has all the instructions packed into this one sheet. It's very dense. We'll go through it after I circle back and show you the overview of it all first. First, I wanted to show you page 2. Page 2 has the queries, the questions that you're going to ask. These include the queries of delusion-like, hallucination-like, and disorganized communication. Zooming, let's see, page 3 are the ways in which you rate here. So let me, zoom in on this. Here you see how the mini collects ratings on each of the symptoms. Again, more on this as we go, but there's a lot of action going on this part of the mini SIPs. All right, then you get to this fourth and final page that goes over the scoring and ultimately leads us to the diagnosis that we might be searching for. Before we dive deeper into how to do it, the mini SIPS gives us an overview. Now, this first part here you see here, this is how the mini SIPS defines the attenuated psychosis syndrome. Now, you remember I introduced that concept from the DSM's perspective. The mini SIPS overlaps almost entirely. Excuse me. All right, here's how the mini SIPS defines the attenuated psychosis syndrome, or APS, as we call it. So APS is understood as a symptomatic syndrome that suggests elevated risk for developing a full threshold psychosis disorder in the future. As a reminder, an APS diagnosis is only relevant if the person has never previously experienced full psychosis. The symptoms we're looking for are psychotic-like, but they're below the threshold, meaning they're less severe, more transient, and typically insight is still present. To meet criteria for APS using the mini SIPS, there must be at least one attenuated symptom. It must occur on average at least once per week, and there has to be onset or worsening in the past year. And it must be distressing or impairing, so much so to warrant clinical attention or care. Finally, the symptom cannot be better explained by another DSM or another psychiatric disorder. Okay, so that sets the stage for what the mini SIPS thinks about when it's talking about the attenuated psychosis syndrome. And again, that lines up really nicely with the DSM. Now, the mini SIPS begins with two foundational steps: introducing the tool and gathering background history. Start by clearly explaining to the participant what the mini SIPS is and what to expect. Let them know that you'll be asking standard questions. Some may feel relevant, others may not, and that's okay. There are no right or wrong answers. This part of the interview is also a chance to build rapport, one of the most important things that you can do when doing an assessment, mini SIPS or otherwise. Approach the mini SIPS with warmth, clarity, and genuine curiosity. Now, step 2 here involves gathering a general background and medical history, covering areas like developmental milestones, medical conditions, past psychiatric treatment, medications, trauma, and educational and occupational functioning. If a parent or other informant is available and willing, they can be included in your information gathering here, of course, with the young person's permission. Now, as you gather this information, don't just look for challenges. This is a time to zero in on strengths as well. Having a strengths-based approach to the mini SIPS will go a long way in terms of getting better data and joining with your client in ways that are going to be more helpful for them and you as you have a shared mission with them. I say noticing and naming, pointing out resilience early on sets a collaborative tone that will pay dividends in the long run. Now, here's an example intro script. This is something that you can use to introduce the mini SIPS when you're working with someone. Don't feel like you have to say this verbatim or read it or memorize it, but it does give some good ideas. Maybe I'll read it with y'all and annotate or give you some of my thoughts as we go along. Now, it says, what we're going to be doing today is called a mini SIPS interview. So I'm naming it. I'm identifying that it's an interview. It's an assessment interview to help you and me understand some of the experiences you might be having, and for us to see how we can partner with you so that these things don't become more serious. You have like some partner language in here. So we're joining together. It's to help both of us. And there's it ends with like a note of prevention. So we're trying to limit the implications that some of the challenges that they might have will how they'll sink or set hold. So as I continue here, the questions I'm going to ask, they're not designed specifically for you. They're the same questions I ask everyone your age. That is a really important component here because it helps the person not feel like you're just singling them out. Sometimes people are worried that you think they're crazy and that's why you're asking them these questions. So this normalizes this experience for them. For that reason, you're going to be able to relate to some of them, but not others. But that's okay. As long as you can be as open as honest as possible, it will be just fine. So that prior to the second to last line there gives them a little bit of a permission structure, so that they don't feel maybe a little less demand characteristics in terms of saying yes or no to questions. And then we make a plea towards honesty, so that we set the tone for them being able to share openly and in ways that will be really helpful for them and us. All right, so this is step 3. This is where we really begin to dig in as we're going through the different steps that the instruction page leads us through with the mini SIPS. In step 3, we start assessing symptoms across the 3 core domains: delusion-like symptoms, hallucination-like symptoms, and disorganized communication. For each of these categories, ask every query. In other words, every question. Even if the person says no to the first one, keep going. If the person endorses multiple symptoms in a category or class, you'll focus on the most severe one as you move forward. And here's an important key. We're not just checking off yes or no. The mini SIPS wants us to go further. We're listening for the nature and quality of the experience, how often it happens, when it started, and whether it's gotten worse, whether the person believes it's imaginary or real, and whether it's distressing or gets in the way of how they think, feel, relate, or behave. Okay, so for each endorsed item or query, you should gather information on the following. So the first is the nature, like the content or the essence, the general description. Quality, how formed is it? How much do they describe it? Frequency, how often does it occur? Time course, when did it start? Has it changed? The timeline here is important for diagnosing that. When we'll get to that towards the end. Then insight, is it real or imaginary? So what's their degree of conviction or doubt? Really important for distinguishing risk from full psychosis. And the last thing, I have 2 more. Distress, how bothersome it is. And then the last one is interference, how this affects thinking and feeling about themselves, social relationships, or others. Now, one note here, as I mentioned on the prior slide, if they have a bunch of yeses or they say yes to a variety of different symptoms, rate the one that's highest within that class or category. Explore that one in more detail. In step 4, gives us a more of a sense, a guidance for how we can explore depth and detail. Here, we determine whether the symptoms endorsed fall within the psychosis range, either currently or at any point in the past. To do this, we compare what the person shared to the symptom-specific anchors on page 3 of the mini SIPS, which I will show you soon. But we don't stop there. We also consider 2 critical dimensions: distress and interference. Now, this table here lays out helpful frameworks. In the what they call normal or typical range, symptoms might be a little odd or puzzling, but they're not distressing. The person notices them perhaps, but they can brush them off. I'd be reluctant to even call these symptoms in many cases, maybe just experiences or extraordinary experiences. In the apps range, the experiences are more troubling. They might be distracting, distressing, or even anticipated, like they're on the lookout for them. Thinking, emotions, relationships, and or behavior, they all could be impacted within the apps range. And in the psychosis range, symptoms are seriously distressing and or persistently interfering with daily life. So this table, it helps us place symptoms on a continuum. Is it typical, just quirky or unusual? That's on the left side of the table. Is it attenuated and possibly indicative of psychosis risk? Or is it full threshold psychosis, calling for a different clinical response and maybe requiring a higher level of care? Okay. Now let me move on to the next slide here. This is step 5. Now, in step 5, we're narrowing our focus, not just whether symptoms are present, but whether they're currently falling within the app severity range, and whether that's been true over the past month. To determine this, we use the symptom-specific anchors on page 3 that we just covered. These provide structured guidance for each symptom category, like the unusual thought content. Within that, we have suspiciousness and grandiosity. Again, we're looking at where on the spectrum the experiences fall. So here, the typical range, a person's thoughts or beliefs, they may be a little unusual, but still within cultural norms. They might defend those ideas, but those ideas and their beliefs aren't impairing. In the apps range, those beliefs or experiences exceed cultural norms or contextual norms and norms of those around them, and may come from outside sources or seem real, but the person still expresses some level of doubt. In the psychosis range, the symptoms feel, sorry about that. Let me just cover that one last part that I skipped there. I was talking about the psychosis range. In there, the symptoms, the symptom or symptoms may feel fully real. The person's convinced, and you can't induce skepticism, even intermittently. So in this step, we're combining what we've learned about in terms of content, conviction, distress, and interference, and we're asking, does this symptom qualify as attenuated psychosis right now, like current or in the past month? If yes, we continue to step 6 and then beyond. If no, we may be looking at a typical experience or something that's better explained by some other mental health concern. So once you've identified that a symptom falls in the apps range, step 6 helps you determine whether it's an active clinical concern or more of a passing experience. There are 3 key questions we ask here. Those include, has the symptom occurred at least once per week in the past month? Once per week in the past month. Did it begin or worsen in the past year? And is it distressing or disabling, even to a moderate degree? If the answer to all 3 is yes, we move forward with considering apps. So apps is still on the table. If not, we may be looking at something that doesn't quite meet threshold, or that no longer requires the same level of clinical care, or would lead to a diagnosis of the attenuated psychosis syndrome. Step 7, again, we're just following through the step-by-step on the cover page or the front page of the mini SIPS itself. This step is about clinical judgment. And this one, I kind of feel like it can get a little tricky. Here, you're asking, are the symptoms better accounted for by another diagnosis? Or are they about clinical high risk for psychosis or attenuated psychosis syndrome, which I'm using synonymously here? So, as I mentioned, this can be tricky. And it's common, really, for people to meet criteria for both apps and another DSM-5 diagnosis. But if the symptoms are in the apps range, if those symptoms are clearly characteristic of that other disorder, then you just don't give it an apps diagnosis. This is the mini SIPS's way of honoring our clinical judgment. But, actually, let me give you an example. So let's say someone has an unrealistic fear of dying during a panic attack. The fear may be unrealistic, but that's definitely better explained by panic disorder. That wouldn't be in apps, even though it might trigger things. Another example, let's say they're deeply pessimistic about failure that could be and this failure might be part of them being experiencing major depression. That would be better explained by depression. But sometimes it's hard to tell. Symptoms can overlap. Contextual stressors can cloud things. Cultural and developmental factors can shape how things show up. That's why the mini SIPS recommends that if you're in doubt, or if it's kind of like a tie, if it's in a gray zone, consider it apps, because apps can coexist with other experiences. So other things here, think about the nature of the experience, the temporality, when did it happen? But in general, use your clinical tools. Think about the nature of the experience, the timing, and how the symptom shows up across situations to make an informed decision about whether or not it's better accounted for by something else, or if it's about apps or CHRP. Okay, let's move on to scoring, which is step 8. Now, we're going to go through this in more detail soon, but for now, just notice how it's broken into 2 key sections. The first section helps us decide whether the person has ever crossed into full psychosis, either based on severity or frequency. And as you'll recall, that's really important because based on the mini SIPS as well as the full SIPS, if a person has ever crossed threshold for psychosis, currently or in the past, they can't then again meet for risk or an APS diagnosis. Now, the second section, that hold on one second. That second section, let me just tell you about that. And that actually guides us through whether they qualify for apps or not. Now, assuming they've not already met for threshold psychosis, of course. If they haven't met for threshold psychosis, then we determine if they meet for apps. Now, there are some clear cutoffs here, but you'll notice it still requires some clinical judgment, especially when accounting for severity, distress, interference, and comorbidity. Okay, let's see here. All right. The final step pulls everything together that we've done so far and guides us through a structured decision tree to determine whether the person meets for DSM-5 criteria for apps or clinical high risk for psychosis, which is the same, or whether their symptoms fall within full psychosis or not. Now, we start at the top by asking, have any of the 3 target symptoms, delusion-like symptoms, hallucination-like symptoms, or disorganization, have any of them ever reached the psychosis range? If so, have those symptoms ever been dangerous or seriously disorganizing? And if either of those is true, then the person can't receive an APS diagnosis. That's because they've already crossed the threshold for psychosis. Now, if not, we ask a second question. Have the symptoms ever been in the psychosis range for at least 1 hour per day, 4 days a week, over 1 month? If yes, again, this is another pathway to meet for threshold psychosis. This would not be risk. However, if the answer is no to all of the above, we move on to the APS diagnosis section. And we ask, does the person have 1 or more symptoms that may qualify for APS? If yes, they don't qualify for psychosis, and they don't qualify for psychosis, they're eligible for an APS diagnosis. You record the date that APS began, like the first time the symptom started. And if they don't qualify, you'll check the reason, whether symptoms are too infrequent or mild or better accounted for by another diagnosis. That's it. Then this step, really, it's not just about checking boxes. This is the area that we ensure that your determination is clinically sound. It's defensible. You can make an argument or a case for your determination, and is rooted in what we've gathered throughout the interview. This is the scoring page for delusion-like symptoms, one of the 3 main symptoms or symptom classes assessed with the mini SIPS. I want to circle back to this section to give you more examples and to dig a little deeper into the scoring now. You'll notice that there are 3 subtypes listed: unusual thought content, things like ideas of reference or perplexing experiences that don't quite track with shared reality; suspiciousness, which might show up as guardedness or hypervigilance; and grandiosity, where someone might express unrealistic beliefs about their abilities or significance. Each symptom is rated into one of 3 ranges. Normal range means the experience may be atypical in one context, but really fits within contextual norms and what might be expected in the person's life and surrounding community. The APS range means the content exceeds typical levels. It might seem imaginary or generally internal. It might feel real, but there is still room for skepticism or reflection. But this exceeds normal contextual expectations. Then there's the psychosis range. This is the psychosis range is when the belief is experienced as completely real and fixed, even in the face of evidence or counterpoints. What really distinguishes these categories is the person's conviction and the presence or absence of doubt. Now, once you've rated the symptom severity, importantly, you come to this checklist at the bottom of the scoring page. These 6 questions are really the bridge between a symptom being interesting and a symptom being clinically meaningful in the SIPS and the ways in which the mini SIPS conceptualizes it. Is the symptom currently in the APS range? Does it occur at least once per week? Has it begun or worsened in the past year? Does it bother the patient? Does it interfere with functioning? And is it not better accounted for by another disorder? If the answer is yes to all 6, then the symptom can be carried forward as one that may qualify for an APS diagnosis. If any of these 6 aren't endorsed, then even if the symptom looks unusual, it won't count towards APS. And just to be clear, you go through the same process for hallucination-like symptoms and disorganized communication symptoms. Later, when you get to the diagnostic decision page, the mini-SIPS pulls all this stuff together. If at least one symptom in any of the 3 domains meets all 6 of these conditions, and the person hasn't crossed into the threshold of psychosis, then they qualify for APS. If none of the symptoms make it through this 6-question filter, then they don't. Then they can't meet for APS. So you can think of this section as the gatekeeper step, and it's really important. I'm not going to emphasize it again now, but this is a key moment within the mini SIPS. It ensures that what you're calling APS is not only present and clinically relevant, but also recent, frequent, and impairing, which is exactly how the mini SIPS ties its symptom ratings to the DSM-5 criteria. So here's the key takeaway. If the 6 boxes aren't checked, the symptom stops here and doesn't contribute to a final APS determination. But if they are checked, then it's possible that the person might meet APS through this symptom. Okay. So here, similarly, circling back to hallucination-like symptoms, these refer to unusual sensory experiences, which can involve hearing things like murmurs or voices, seeing shadows or figures, or even olfactory or gustatory or tactile touch experiences that don't have an external source. As with the other symptom domains, we rate these on a 3-level continuum. Normal range, they call it. Experiences may include brief sensory distortions, like thinking you heard your name or catching a flicker in peripheral vision, but then just kind of blowing it off and it not having any meaning or import. APS range, these experiences go a step further. They exceed the societal or the person's contextual expectations beyond the expectations of those around them, and can seem imaginary or could seem real, but the person can still question them, either on their own or after talking it through with someone. They say, yeah, I don't know, maybe that doesn't make sense. Then we have the psychosis range. This one means that the perceptual abnormalities feel fully real. These are formed experiences like hearing a clear voice or seeing a figure, and the person can't be talked out of them, even intermittently. They have a strong belief in the experiences. Okay. All right. This is the scoring section for disorganized communication. Now we're looking at the quality and coherence of speech. This includes things like odd speech, such as an overly elaborate or metaphoric use of language, unfocused speech, which might be muddled, off track, or confusing, and meandering speech, like when someone goes off on tangents or gets overly circumstantial. We rate the continuum or the communication on the same 3-level continuum. Typical range, someone might be a little off vague or wordy, but they're not truly off track. They can still follow the conversation. They don't need redirection. In the apps range, you might start to see more notable issues. Speech may be tangential or disorganized, and the person might need prompting or general redirection to stay on topic. But with structure, they can still communicate effectively. Psychosis range communication is more extreme. Speech is persistently loose, irrelevant, or unintelligible, even when the person isn't under pressure. At this level, redirection, it doesn't work, at least not intermittently. This qualifies maybe as conceptualized as derailment. Now, keep in mind there could be linguistic factors or other things that can influence things, so don't always, so make sure you interpret in that context. And then, again, here I'm just highlighting some questions that you ask to get us the right information to get a good diagnosis. And and these come up later as well. Okay. The mini-SIPS wants us to exclude whether or not someone has psychosis. Now, we determine whether someone qualifies for a full threshold psychosis disorder with some of the rules within the mini-SIPS. If they do qualify for psychosis, then they can't meet for one of the they can't meet for a risk syndrome. All right, so it's these are mutually exclusive. If they have psychosis, then they can't be at risk. All right, there are key questions to ask here. Has the person ever had a symptom in the psychosis range? We're referring to the psychosis range definition we reviewed earlier, where skepticism is lost and the experience feels entirely real. If yes, ask, has the symptom ever been seriously disorganizing or dangerous? If either of these are true, then the person meets criteria for threshold psychosis, and you shouldn't give an APS diagnosis because they meet for psychosis. If neither of those apply, ask, has the symptom ever occurred, meaning if they haven't been seriously disorganizing or dangerous, then you ask, has the symptom ever occurred for at least 1 hour per day, 4 days per week over a month? If yes, this also qualifies as full threshold psychosis, and you shouldn't give them APS. So basically, the mini-SIPS defines the presence of psychosis as a symptom in the psychosis range based on some of the anchors we talked about before, and the symptom being very dangerous or disorganizing. Like, for instance, one example of seriously dangerous is a person maybe one time heard a command hallucination, and that command hallucination told them to walk upstairs, go into the bathtub, turn the water on, fill the bathtub up, and turn on their hairdryer and drop the hairdryer into the bathtub with them. And they did it. That is so dangerous that even if that only happened one time, that would constitute full threshold psychosis based on the mini. Now, the second thing you see here is that frequency of at least 1 hour per day, 4 times per week for a month. Let's say that same person heard that command hallucination, but never made it to the point where they dropped the hairdryer into the bathtub. If it happened one time, that might not be full psychosis. But if they were hearing voices like that regularly, at least an hour per day, 4 times per week for a month, even though it wasn't dangerous, the frequency and severity would lead to a threshold psychosis. So in short, this step is about ruling in psychosis and ruling out APS when there is psychosis. So, and psychosis is based on severity, danger, maybe duration as well. If a person has ever had psychosis, I know I've mentioned this several times, but if they've ever had psychosis, currently or in the past, they can't be at risk. Okay. Okay, more details there about how it defines psychosis. All right. Continuing on with excluding, including. This step is completed only if the person does not meet criteria for threshold psychosis. So this step is about APS diagnosis. So assume that they don't meet psychosis, then we can proceed to see if they meet for risk. And here we're asking, does the person have one or more of the symptoms from page 3 that may qualify for the APS, so the attenuated level diagnosis? If the answer is yes, and we've already ruled out full psychosis, then the person will qualify for a DSM-5 APS diagnosis. You'll then record that date when APS began. So you find out, you ask them when the symptom first emerged. This could be the reported onset of the symptoms in the APS range, or the point at which the frequency, severity, and distress met threshold. So it was like, oh yeah, this is in the APS range. This step wraps everything up into the diagnostic conclusion, assuming all prior steps have been satisfied. All right. Okay. You got this? No, this one. You got this. All right. So we've gone through a bunch of the aspects of the mini SIPS. And now I'm just going to ask you a few questions as we continue to march forward through this. So no judgment. This is just for fun. You don't have to record any answers, and you're not accountable to this with me. But trivia. Mini SIPS trivia. Okay. True or false? An APS diagnosis can be given for a patient currently showing attenuated psychosis symptoms who has previously met for schizophrenia. Okay. Remember, I won't be grading these, so no problem. But true or false? If a person's already met for schizophrenia at some point, can they meet for APS? Okay, the answer to that is false. They can't meet APS if they've ever met for full psychosis or schizophrenia, which constitutes full psychosis in the past. Okay. All right, let's go on to the next question. All right, Fred reports feeling that something odd and weird is going on around him. He also reports that occasionally time seems to move in slow motion and that he has vivid deja vu that confuses him. He said, he doesn't remember exactly when all this began, but it got worse about 6 months ago. Happens about once a week, is distressing to him, and makes him withdraw from others. What do you think? Would this be typical functioning? Would it fall into APS or psychosis? All right. Best answer here is APS. So Fred is likely somewhere in the APS range. That would be the best one. A little bit more than what you would expect for typical experiences, and not formed and not enough conviction for full psychosis. All right, what about this one? Sam reported that about once a month, she hears a noise in her head that almost sounds like a voice. It's vague and she can't distinguish what it is, if anything. This usually happens when she's stressed or tired, but she states she's not particularly bothered by these experiences and can get her mind to move on to other thoughts when the noises occur. What do you think about this one? She's giving some context here. Only when she's stressed, not bothersome. She moves on. She doesn't really fixate on it too much. Those factors lead me to believe that the best answer here is typical functioning. So this would not be something that we would pathologize for Sam. What about our next question? Xavier. Xavier reported that several times a week, he hears a voice telling him to do things like walk down the center of the highway in bare feet during periods of high traffic. He always complies or does what those voices command him to do because he believes that bad things will happen if he doesn't. What do you think here? Remember, we were talking about the concept of dangerousness in conjunction with the severity of symptoms. And I think in Xavier's case, we have that command hallucinations that he's responding to, and through behavior change, that's dangerous. So psychosis, likely the best answer here. All right. Let's read this one. This one's about disorganized communication or disorganization. During the interview, when asked about his physical health history, Lee responded by talking about a time he broke his arm playing baseball. He then relayed a reminiscence about a friend who had played baseball with him in high school, but went to a different college, and then a reminiscence of his college roommate, who he characterized as probably a swinger, quote unquote. When the interviewer prompted him to return to the question about physical health, Lee apologized and mentioned that he's disturbed by this tendency to meander and ramble, which he said has begun to happen quite frequently in the past few months, and that many of his friends and family had noticed it too and expressed concern, which is why he came into the clinic. All right, what do you think? For me, this one could maybe, I don't know, it's tricky. Like I'd need a little bit more information to kind of get a real sense as to the level of severity here. But I'm definitely seeing something in the psychosis continuum range. I think with the information I have here, the fact that he's still doing okay, um, based on what I can tell here, I'd put this in the apps range, but this very well could extend beyond. Okay. All right. Now, I want to give you even more rich, detailed example of a person that might be at risk for psychosis and how the mini SIPs might more or less look or, help us tease stuff apart if we're working with a real full client that might have a lot going on. So this is a long one. I'm going to read through it, and I encourage you just to follow along, and then I'll maybe summarize some of the things that I saw from it after I share it with you. So Ryan is a 21-year-old part-time server attending community college, lives with a roommate, and has been grappling with unusual perceptions of reality. They often wonder if they're truly in control of their life, sometimes feeling like everything is part of a larger, non-religious picture. Though Ryan can't fully explain this, they describe it as similar to a simulation, yet distinct. This belief began when around age 4, after seeing death for the first time on TV. Social media, Ryan feels, has influenced this idea, but they came up with it independently. While they admit it might just be overthinking, it isn't distressing. Ryan even tests reality through small decisions, hoping to alter it, though these tests don't significantly change their life. Ryan also experiences feelings akin to deja vu, but more intense, almost like they can predict what will happen next. For example, they once knew their brother was about to ask a specific question before it happened. Though Ryan knows logically that it's not possible to predict the future, they still find themselves thinking about it. This sense of premonition happens about once or twice a month. On top of these perceptions, Ryan feels an overwhelming sense of responsibility for negative events that are out of their control. They're convinced, for instance, that their football team's losses was due to poor cheering, or that they caused their cat's death by thinking about it beforehand. This sense of responsibility is distressing and frequently preoccupies Ryan, leading him to overthink their decisions and actions in order to avoid causing harm. While this belief used to affect Ryan multiple times a week, it now happens about once a month. Now, adding to these challenges, Ryan has long struggled with trust issues dating back to childhood bullying. They're suspicious of even close friends recently finding themselves checking behind their back while walking to the mall, fearing their friends might try to trip them. Despite knowing these things are irrational, Ryan can't shake them and reports becoming withdrawn in these situations, seeking reassurance later. These episodes are distressing, yet Ryan is able to generate some self-doubt about the validity of these fears. Occasionally, Ryan also hears sounds that aren't there, like a cat walking or a door opening. They believe these experiences are likely due to their brain misinterpreting sounds or an overactive imagination. While these auditory distortions are brief and happen only once a month, they can sometimes be distressing, prompting Ryan to check their surroundings before moving on. All of these experiences have shaped Ryan's view of the world, creating moments of confusion, over-responsibility, and trust difficulties, though Ryan is trying to maintain control over how they manage these perceptions in everyday life. All right, a lot going on here. Now, let's walk through this case vignette using our mini SIPS lens. So, this is Ryan, 21-year-old college student working part-time, living with a roommate. Right off the bat, I want you to think about the strengths. We're not just focused on symptoms. Ryan has social ties, is engaged in school and work, and is making an effort to understand what's going on. So good start here. Now, Ryan describes unusual perceptions of reality. This is where we start to think, could we be in the attenuated psychosis space? So I'd ask, what kinds of symptoms are being reported, and where do they land? Delusion-like symptoms, hallucination-like symptoms, or disorganization, or all? Now, we get a clear UTC, or unusual thought content, here. Ryan talks about the world possibly being a simulation, but they're not fully convinced. That's an important detail. We also get a clue that the belief started around age 4, tied to a triggering event, in this case, seeing death on TV. So we have a potential onset point. We also have the potential better explained convention, but I think this is probably about CHR or apps. Anyway, this onset point tells us something about when and how this all might have developed. Even though the thought is odd, Ryan isn't necessarily distressed. In fact, they're testing reality, making small decisions to challenge their perception. That tells us about insight and reality testing, both relatively intact. Now, that's a good note in terms of severity. Next, we see something like deja vu, but more intense, feeling like they can predict the future. We've highlighted that delusion question 9. Do you ever think that you can predict the future? This is a great example of like a delusion-like symptom. But notice it's mild, not impairing functioning, and there's some recognition that it's not fully logical. Again, insight is present. Still, we're seeing some interference, right? So it comes up once or twice a month. So there's frequency there, but it's not overwhelming. You'll want to file that away when you're considering the severity anchors, like what level is it? Typical or normal, attenuated psychosis level, or full threshold psychosis. Let's see. Moving on, we see guilt and a sense of responsibility for bad events outside of Ryan's control. This might also fall under unusual thought content. The belief isn't realistic. Ryan thinks that the negative thoughts caused their cat's death, but it's not. It's also not fully fixed. They don't fully believe it. These kinds of guilt-laced thoughts, they actually can be really hard to categorize. But in this case, it's the illogical aspect of the guilt. They show distress, some impairment, behavior change. They're overthinking decisions to avoid harm, but the frequency in that section seems to have gone down. So we're seeing some decreased course there. Now, here's a big one, suspiciousness, delusion-like symptom 11. Ryan mistrusts, it goes back to bullying experiences. So, and trauma and bullying are very much associated with psychosis-risk. But even now, Ryan's weary of friends, checks over their shoulder, worried about being targeted. This is relevant for our assessment for sure. Is the suspicion sort of normative within Ryan's family or friend group? We'd have to learn more about that, but is it grounded in current context, or is it more of a paranoia in its nature? Those are the kinds of questions we want to get to. Ryan's also wondering if others are watching them. So that's sort of a delusion question 12 territory. Again, they know it's probably not true, but it still affects their behavior. They withdraw, they seek reassurance. So you're seeing that a mix of insight and distress and behavior can all kind of come into play here. Think about where that places us on the severity continuum. We also have auditory experiences. Ryan hears things like a door opening or a voice calling their name. That takes us into hallucination-like symptoms 1. But look at the details. These happen about once a month, don't feel totally real, and are probably related to misinterpretation or imagination. So we're likely in the apps range, maybe not, but certainly not threshold psychosis. And again, insight is very much preserved. I'd want to learn more about that from Ryan. Throughout, we want to be asking ourselves, are these experiences happening once per week? Have they worsened in the past year? Are they distressing or impairing, at least to some degree? These are the criteria for determining whether something is active and not just like a passing experience. Then there's the final step. Could any of these symptoms be better accounted for by another condition? In Ryan's case, anxiety, trauma, and contextual challenges definitely play a role. But are they fully accounting for the experiences? Or do these symptoms stand apart? Has apps or clinical high-risk psychosis had a life of its own? If it's unclear or you're on the fence, lean towards giving apps. Last thing, step back and look at the functional implications. Is Ryan managing okay? Mostly yes, but there's some interpersonal strain, emotional distress, and withdrawal. Um, that context matters when you're making your final call, suggestive of not full psychosis. So that's Ryan. Yeah. Keep the mini SIPS framework in mind as you think through this vignette. And where do you see these symptoms fall? Is it totally typical, like in the normal range? Would it be more in the attenuated range or the threshold psychosis range? There's a lot here. If you're interested, you could use this vignette to score through a mini SIPS yourself, and also be thinking like, what would I want to learn more about? How would I want to probe more? Now, we won't get those answers, but that's a good exercise to expand your skills and to increase your SIPS, your mini SIPS sophistication and skill set. Okay. All right, I got another one here. This is our second vignette. It's about a person named Sam. So Sam, a 25-year-old who works gig jobs like Uber and DoorDash, lives alone in a small studio apartment. They only have one close friend, but find it difficult to trust even that friend, them. Sam describes themselves as deeply mistrustful person, constantly feeling like others might be talking about them behind their back, even though there's no clear evidence to confirm this. This suspicion extends to everyone in Sam's life, making it hard for them to relax or open up, even with people they've known for years. They trace these feelings back to 2018 when they realized that many things their mother told them during her psychotic episode weren't true. Recently, Sam experienced something new. They began feeling as though someone else was controlling their thoughts, even removing certain thoughts from their mind. They're unsure if this is real or imagined, but the uncertainty alone has been distressing. It makes Sam question what is truly within their control, leaving them feeling unsettled. These episodes used to occur more frequently, every few days or for about 10 to 20 minutes, but now happen once every few weeks or so. On top of this, Sam occasionally feels detached from their body and surroundings, a dissociative experience where familiar environments feel foreign. When this happens, Sam becomes somewhat, but not fully convinced that they're in a place they don't recognize, even though they know intellectually it's their apartment. They started to believe that this dissociation is a way for their brain to cope with stress. These episodes can last anywhere from 1 day to a week and happen about once a month, with the most recent one lasting 3 days. When it occurs, Sam has to remind themselves that the objects in their apartments are, in fact, theirs. Another unsettling experience happened in late November when Sam thought they heard whispers calling their name. For a moment, they believed it was real, but quickly snapped out of it when they realized the closest person was several houses away. The experience, which lasted only a few minutes, left Sam terrified. Though they know it wasn't real, the event still lingers in their mind. In recent months, Sam has also noticed they've been having trouble communicating clearly. They struggle to find the right words and often lose their train of thought, which leads to long pauses and frustration. These issues, which started in January, have become a source of anxiety for Sam, particularly because they've always had difficulty expressing their experience to their family and providers. Sam attributes these difficulties to social anxiety, but wonders if there's something more going on. Cultural and linguistic barriers within their family further complicate their ability to communicate, leaving Sam feeling isolated and misunderstood. Despite these challenges, Sam continues to navigate their everyday life, balancing work with their ongoing struggles. but their experiences leave them feeling disconnected from those around them. All right, let's take a look at Sam's story through the mini SIPS lens. As we go, I'll call out things to pay attention to that should trigger your thinking about symptoms, severity, and ultimately whether Sam meets criteria for attenuated psychosis. So, Sam, 25, works gig jobs. These are strengths to note. They're functional, living independently, and able to maintain employment. But right away, we hear about suspiciousness. Sam struggles with trust, even with their one close friend. They describe a deep sense of mistrust, often feeling like people are talking about them behind their back. These are like delusion, like item 10 and 11 kind of territory range. Now, importantly, there's no clear evidence for these beliefs, but the suspicion spans across contexts, affecting even long-standing relationships. That's a red flag. It's also impacting behavior. They're guarded, they withdraw. So even if the conviction isn't total, the symptom is interfering with functioning. Sam ties these feelings back to 2018 when their mother mentioned something during an episode that later turned out to be untrue. That's our salient event, and it helps ground the timeline a bit. Next, we see something more novel. Sam recently started feeling like someone else is putting thoughts into their mind or taking them out. That harkens back to thought control delusion 5. The key here is the uncertainty. Sam's not sure what's real. That doubt is what pulls us into APS territory and not psychosis. They're distressed by it, and it's happening more often now, every few days for 10 to 20 minutes. So you've got distress, frequency, and a sense of loss of control. That checks a lot of the boxes for an attenuated symptom. We also get delusion-like symptom 2. Sam sometimes feels detached from their surroundings. Rooms feel strange or unfamiliar. Even though they know it's their own apartment, it feels foreign. This is sort of classic derealization or depersonalization, which can overlap with attenuated psychosis symptoms. Sam has some insight, though. It's not totally convincing, and they've developed a coping skill by grounding themselves in their environment. Then we get to a hallucination-like symptom 1 moment. Sam hears whispers calling their name. For a brief moment, they believe it's real. That's the conviction piece, but it passes quickly. These types of experiences, they're sort of tricky to conceptualize. They can pop up in the general population, but the distress and salience matters. In Sam's case, even though it was short-lived, it left them terrified, and they still think about it. That's distressing, even if the frequency is low. Now, don't want to overlook disorganization. So disorganization 2 symptom at the end comes up here. Sam's struggling to communicate, losing their train of thought, rambling, and getting frustrated. There's a change from baseline, and it's been happening since January. Now, we want to think about whether this speech disorganization is truly disorganization or more like anxiety. Sam says it's impacting how they interact with others, and it's a source of distress. So it's possible that could put us in the attenuated range. So we'll have to keep thinking about that. And also, because this is a vignette, we don't know, but we'd really be trying to gain information from how Sam is interacting with us to really weigh in on this organization. Finally, it's possible Sam's language background may complicate how symptoms are experienced and expressed. That's something we definitely don't want to overlook. And it's something we want to contextualize in the grander scheme of things. Always ask, is this symptom expected in your family and those you spend time with, or is it beyond those norms, and is it distressing? So overall, Sam presents with multiple experiences across delusions, hallucinations, and disorganization. We see the symptoms that are novel or worsening. We see some distress. We see interference in frequency. All things we consider when assessing for an APS diagnosis. Now, your job is to walk through the mini SIPS steps if you want to take this further and see, where do you think these symptoms fall in terms of severity? Do they pass threshold criteria for active symptoms? Are they better explained by another condition like trauma or anxiety, or do they have a life of their own? And how do these experiences impact Sam's daily functioning? Ultimately, do we think this is about CHRP or apps, or is this more or less? Okay. All right. I just want to briefly introduce a few other measures that can be used in conjunction with, or oftentimes before, the mini SIPs. Think of this as like this part of our time together as like the post-credits scene, some bonus material here. I will say self-report measures can be incredibly useful in clinical settings. Um, one major advantage is that they're typically very brief, even briefer than the mini SIPs, and many of them are free, which is always good. They're also easy to administer. Clients can fill them out while they're waiting for services or waiting to see you. But one of the biggest values of self-report is in how they complement the clinical interview. You can compare what the person reports on paper with what they share during the interview. Does it line up? Great. That adds support to your clinical impressions. But sometimes the information is different, and that's just as helpful. Discrepancies can tell you a lot about insight, response bias, or symptom fluctuation. Making sure that there's a shared understanding between you and the client and the questionnaire that they're filling out makes a world of difference in finding the root of their challenges and helping to partner with them to solve some of the challenges that they are experiencing. So whether the self-report confirms or contrasts with what you learn from the mini SIPs afterwards, either way, you're learning something good. All right, there's a few self-report measures that I want to mention the PRIME screen in particular. Although I really like the PQB as well, but the PRIME screen is great. And you might see it labeled as the PSR. It's been in the literature for a while, and it's a brief screener. It focuses on positive symptoms only, or for the most part. And so we're talking about things like unusual thought content, suspiciousness, and perceptual experiences. All stuff that's going to help you conceptualize risk for psychosis. Just 12 items. The respondent rates each one from 0 to 6. 0 is definitely disagree. 6 is definitely agree. If someone scores high on an item, the follow-up is, how much distress is this causing? And how much is it interfering if there is a distress? Some versions don't use distress, by the way, but so we're looking at the one, I'm talking about the one that does, but it gives you a sense as to what's going on and how it's bothering them or impacting them. It's pretty accurate at identifying folks who might be at risk while also minimizing false alarms, but it's not diagnostic. It's a great entry point. And if someone scores high on this, it'd be an opportunity for a good conversation about what's going on, perhaps segueing into a mini SIPS evaluation. All right, I mentioned briefly in the prior slide the Prodromal questionnaire B, another good one. Like the PRIME, this one focuses on positive symptoms. So again, we're talking about things like unusual beliefs, perceptual shifts, or suspiciousness. But the format's a little different. The PQB has 21 yes or no items. So instead of a scale, this is just like, did this happen, yes or no? If they say yes, each item has a distress and impairment follow-up prompt. So we're not just checking boxes, we're seeing if it matters clinically, which can be really helpful. It's user-friendly, it's fast, it works well as a screening tool, and I would say a yes alone doesn't indicate risk, but if there's several yeses, it might warrant a conversation to make sure that there's a shared understanding of how those questions are intended to be understood and how the client is understanding them. And then if there is, you can move on to mini SIPs. All right. The last thing I'll mention is about screening is the 2-item screener. And this came out of some collaborative work with one of my former one of my former students and current colleague, Peter Phelan. But this screen actually grew out of a request from a local community mental health center we were partnering with. They'd been using the prime screen for a while, but after a few months, they came back and said, this is just too long, Jason. We want to use it, but it's too much to implement, even though it's only 12 items. So we listened. We looked at all of our data and tried to figure out whether we could identify a couple of items that were both theoretically sound and empirically strong. So these two rose to the top. Do you ever hear a voice of someone talking that other people cannot hear? That targets perceptual disturbances, something that tends to be particularly informative when thinking about psychosis risk. And then the other one, have you ever felt like someone was playing with your mind? That's getting at thought interference or unusual thought content. Again, something we often see early on. Now that one could get some false positives, so always good to have a conversation. We are not claiming this is a replacement for structured interview like the mini-SIPS by any means. But in settings where time is tight and capacity is stretched, 2-item screening offers a brief, usable tool that can still catch a meaningful signal. It's just one step maybe towards making early identification more feasible in the kinds of real-world settings we often work in. And ultimately, I think this could be a great precursor conversation for a longer mini-SIPS. Okay, just a few tips as we wrap up, or some other ideas. If you're interested in a bit more mini-SIPS training, there's a quick and accessible way. Yale University hosts a short online training and assessment. It takes about 30 minutes, especially since you're already familiar with the training. It will probably fly by. You'll find the link here on this slide if you're interested. This is not mandatory to use the tool, but it's a great additional exposure. And personally, I think it's fun and a great way to continue to sharpen your skills. If you're interested in a bit more about the mini-SIPS and the construct that it evaluates in general, this book here, it's a classic in the clinical high risk for psychosis or attenuated psychosis field. Definitely worth a read if you want to dive a little bit deeper. And that brings us to the end of our walkthrough of the mini-SIPS. We have definitely covered a lot, from how to conceptualize risk to the nuts and bolts of the mini-SIPS itself, to practical screening tools at the end that can help flag folks who might benefit from a mini-SIPS or early intervention. My hope is that this gave you a better sense of how these tools work, why they matter, and how they can be used responsibly in real-world settings. If you're feeling like you want to dive a little deeper, I have other trainings to dig into. But if you're just walking away today with a clearer understanding of how we can catch signs of psychosis early and respond thoughtfully, I'm grateful for your energy and partnership today and hope that this hit the mark. All right, so thanks for hanging in. Thanks for caring about this work. And thanks for all you do. I hope our paths cross again soon.
Thank you for joining us for this session in our Early Psychosis Learning Series. The Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, TDMHSAS, extends gratitude to our collaborating partners, the Tennessee Association of Mental Health Organizations, TAMHO, and Park Center, for their support in bringing this series to life, and to our presenter, Dr. Jason Schiffman, for generously sharing his time, knowledge, and expertise. Thank you again for your commitment to learning and for the vital work you do. We hope you continue to engage with the series and take away insights that support your practice and the young people we serve.